Hi, my name is Barbara Sundheimer Extein, Sundheimer, Extein, and I came to Boca Raton in 1984.
Hello, my name is Dr. Miriam Sanoa-Dallin, and I am a volunteer interviewer for the Boca Raton Historical Society and Museum. The museum is conducting a series of interviews to document the development and growth of Boca Raton's Jewish community. Today is July 14th, 2017, and I am here in the television studio of Lynn University with Barbara Extein. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ms. Extein.
Thank you.
And I thought we would start by having us tell you a little bit about yourself, where you were born, where you grew up, what kind of Jewish background that you had. Tell us about that.
I was born in Atlantic City, New Jersey, and grew up in a small residential community down the beach from Atlantic City called Margate, right 3 houses in from the beach. So I'm a beach bum.
Wow.
And it was a small community, but a large Jewish population. We belonged to a conservative synagogue called Beth Judah, which was in Ventnor, New Jersey. And I went to nursery school there, and I went to Sunday school there, and I went to after-school Hebrew school. I think it was 3 days a week, and was bat mitzvahed there and was married there.
That's lovely. You went 3 days a week to Hebrew school.
Yes.
And what was your family doing in Atlantic City? Was your family involved in any of the businesses there?
My mother was born in Atlantic City, and her parents lived in Atlantic City. My father was actually born in Birmingham, Alabama, and I think he only spent a short time as an infant in Birmingham. And then his parents lived in Atlantic City also. And both my parents went to Atlantic City High School, where I also went, and my sister went. And my father was a salesman. My mother was a stay-at-home mom. Neither of my parents went to college. My father started college at City College in New York, and it was the Depression. And so he dropped out of college, and he was in the Army in World War II. He was away from the family before I was born, but my sister was born for 2 years before he came back.
Mm-hmm. And so I've heard a great deal about the Atlantic City Jewish community. They were connected to the New York Jewish community in many ways. There was a lot of salespeople and merchants and so on. Did you know your grandparents?
I knew my mother's parents. My grandmother lived into her 90s, and so we had a very close relationship with those grandparents. And my 2 uncles, my mother's brothers, also lived in Atlantic City, so I had cousins who were there. My grandmother on my father's side passed away right before I was born, so I'm named after her. Her name was Bella, and so my Hebrew name is after Bella. And I have a cousin who was born about 5 months later, and she's also named after Bella, so we're both Barbaras. And my grandfather on that side lived in North Carolina with my father's older sister. And so I knew him a little bit, but he passed away when I was about 5 years old, so didn't really have a relationship with him.
What do you remember about your grandparents? Do you remember anything about where they were born or when they came to the United States or anything like that?
Well, they all came well before the war. My grandmother...
Which war? World War II. Yes.
My grandmother on my mother's side was from Russia, and my grandfather was from Poland. On my father's side, named Sundheimer, were from Germany. And I think my grandmother on that side was from Russia, but my grandfather was from Germany.
Let me just interject. In 1924, they basically shut the doors on American immigration. It was very difficult to come into the country after that. Did they come into the country after
No,
the 1920s
before,
or
but I don't
before?
know exactly when.
That's okay. Just wanted to make that
Yes.
find out. Yeah.
My grandfather, Jake, who was my mother's father, was in the fruit and vegetable business. So I thought that was and a big fisherman, which he passed down to the other generations. So.
Recreational fishermen?
Yes.
Or
Yes.
did you ever find out? So what part of Europe were they from? Do you recall?
No, not precisely. But my grandparents spoke Yiddish
Yes.
mostly.
What language did they speak?
Well, they spoke English, but they spoke Yiddish. My mother could speak Yiddish, not fluently. Her brother was great at Yiddish. I picked up, a smattering of words, but never really spoke Yiddish. My grandmother never learned to read English, and they used to read the Yiddish newspaper, and yeah.
Did she ever sing any songs to you in Yiddish?
Not that I remember.
Are there any words or expressions that you remember hearing at home?
Just the usual things that people know, but no. But they were very sweet people. To me, they were always very old, and I guess they weren't always very old, but they always seemed to me to be very old.
From your perspective, they
Yes.
certainly were.
Yes, exactly.
So you went to Atlantic City High School, and how did you celebrate the holidays? What do you remember about Passover, Rosh Hashanah?
Well, because my two uncles lived in Atlantic City also, we used to celebrate the holidays at my grandparents' usually. And, we'd celebrate Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and Passover. I remember my grandfather always got this enormous challah, 3 feet long, for the middle of the table. That was very special, with the cousins and the grandparents. And then, later we celebrated, in our own home. And, when I went away to college, that was sort of, it. I mean, I came home for holidays, but we were not super religious. My grandmother, I think, kept a kosher home, but I don't really remember being worrying about things being kosher. My mother did not keep a kosher home, but she always lit the candles on Friday night. And she was very active in the synagogue, in the sisterhood. But we were not particularly observant.
Did you have brothers and sisters?
I have one sister, Susan, who's 6.5 years older than I am.
So did you ever ask the 4 questions on Passover?
Always. Can I take a drink of water?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So after you, do you remember any, how many other Jews were there in your class at school or in your neighborhood? Do you remember feeling?
A lot. At least in elementary school. There were, for a small community, there was a Reform synagogue, there were 2 Reform synagogues, there were 2 conservative synagogues, there were a few Orthodox synagogues. There were a lot of Jewish people. Now, when I went to high school, that was a little bit different because everyone from the entire island, basically, which is Longport, Margate, Ventnor, and Atlantic City, all went to one high school. So the demographics were different.
What was the name of the high school?
Atlantic City High School. Mm-hmm. So, but it was a sizable Jewish community, surprisingly so. There were a lot of Holocaust survivors who came to Atlantic City.
Tell me about them.
I remember there was, when I was a child, there was a man who used to come to the house and deliver eggs. And he was a Holocaust survivor, and he had an egg farm, which I understand is not uncommon. There's actually a lovely book that the Atlantic City Jewish Federation put together on Jewish businesses in Atlantic City. And it has all the hotels and all the small businesses. people like him who you know, a list of all the people who were Holocaust survivors who settled, you know, in Atlantic City. It was a very vibrant community, Jewish community.
I have a question, by the way. The term Holocaust survivors, as the words, didn't really come into use until much later. Do you remember what you called those people of that background
No,
at
I
the
mean,
time?
I didn't call them anything. You know, I know this as an adult. I wasn't aware as a child.
And after high school, where did you go?
I went to Connecticut College, which when I went was Connecticut College for Women in New London, Connecticut. I was the last class of all women. And then everybody went co-ed after that. But I went to a women's college. I wasn't exactly planning on going to a women's college, but it turned out that way, and it was a great experience. And then after college, I worked for a year in New Haven for an architect by the name of Warren Plattner, and then I went to Yale Architecture School.
What was your major at Connecticut?
I was an art major, a studio art major.
So, since you bring it up, what do you think? Do you think there were advantages of being in an all-women's college environment that probably
Yes.
they've missed out on?
Yes, I really do.
What are some of them? What are some of the advantages?
Well, I think people are a little less self-conscious, you know, and encouraged to, you know, speak your mind, and there wasn't a lot of, you know, holding back and letting the guys speak or whatever. Yeah, no, I think there are great advantages to going to a women's college. The disadvantages of going to a women's college is your social life is pretty terrible. It's you're on the road basically if you want to have a social life. But you know, I just sort of missed it by a year, and then all the colleges around who were single-sex colleges all went co-ed. So.
And what do you remember? Was there any Jewish student life at Connecticut College that you recall? Was there?
Well, Connecticut College was sort of interesting. You know, it's New England. It's very waspy.
What town is it in, by the way?
New London, which is where the Coast Guard Academy is. There was a Jewish community. I remember going to the synagogue in New London for a holiday. There wasn't a large Jewish population, but then again, you know, suddenly, I would say maybe 15%, which is not terrible. But when I started, there were a lot of rules that since fell by the wayside because it was the 60s and things changed very rapidly.
What were some of the rules?
Well, one of the rules was that you had to go to chapel every Sunday as a freshman. I can't remember if that was for all 4 years, but I do remember as a freshman that I had to go to chapel and where I learned various hymns that I had never heard before. And that was sort of an eye-opener for me. I'm glad, you know, it exposed me to something different from what I was used to. But that was, you know, required. So I thought that was kind of interesting. So now when I hear Christian hymns, I know them all.
That's actually common at many colleges. In fact, Hillel services on Friday night would fulfill the chapel requirement at Princeton.
Yeah.
So a lot of Jewish men would go to Hillel Friday night just to get out of their chapel requirement, and also Christian men would sign the sheet and get their chapel requirement because they didn't want to get up early on Sunday morning. That was one of the stories from those days. But that, all of that sort of went out the window between 1966 and 1970.
Exactly. Exactly.
What other rules do you remember sort of you had in
you had to sign, you know, out of the dorm, and you had to be back by a certain time. Once a week, the freshmen had to serve dinner to the upperclassmen. It was very, you know, well, I don't know what the word is. It was
Genteel.
very proper. We used to have tea. you know, it was a women's college. It was New England. It was culture shock. You know, we had to wear skirts at that dinner. I think it was on Wednesday night. I can't remember. It was very proper.
Were you allowed to wear pants at all?
That particular dinner.
No, were you allowed to wear pants at other times?
Oh yeah. Oh yes, absolutely.
Were you allowed to stay at a male's apartment overnight by yourself without supervision, or were there rules about
Well,
that?
there was no such thing. I mean, you could go off on the weekend and no one was watching what you were doing, but there was no male on the campus, so that, yes.
Mm. No, there was a very famous story in 1966. A Barnard girl was expelled because she stayed overnight at her boyfriend's apartment.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me.
Mm. And after that, they just dropped all those rules.
Exactly.
So by the time you were a senior, I guess all of this was...
Yes, yes.
And how did you feel about it at the time, that these rules were gone?
Oh, I mean, it was wonderful. It was great. But, remember, this was I graduated from high school in 1968. So this was the feminist movement. This was the anti-war time. It was free speech. It was a revolution when I was in college.
What do you remember? I mean, there's two things that are happening: the women's liberation movement and the anti-Vietnam War protests. What do you remember about those two movements?
Well, I remember we had in my dorm, we had a little get-together of, a consciousness raising get-together of women talking about the women's movement. And I was sort of befuddled because to me it seemed like, what are you talking about? This is obvious. What is the big deal? Like, I didn't really understand that there were things to overcome because somehow I assumed they had already been overcome. So that was sort of interesting, but it was it was a real thing. I remember I remember going to one of the marches on Washington. I don't remember when it was, but I do remember going from school. And I went with a bunch of kids on buses to New York. There were kids we met up, I think, at Yale, and we went to New York, and we went knocking on doors for Lindsay when he was running for mayor.
John Lindsay was running for mayor of New York.
Yeah.
Since you brought it up, do you remember the Supreme Court case Roe v. Wade? What was going on around that time?
I don't remember it. Mm-hmm. I don't remember it. I have friends who had illegal abortions, which is sad but true.
Were any of them hurt or killed by them?
No. Mm-hmm. And I don't remember where they had them, but I had a friend who was going to NYU who had an illegal abortion, and yeah.
Mm-hmm. What about the anti-war movement? What do you remember about that?
Well, I just remember going to Washington. I remember, at that time, you would go to a common room where there was a TV. And I remember every night we would gather and watch the news about the war. We would watch Walter Cronkite on TV and how many people were killed. And yeah, I think it was on everybody's mind, but there wasn't a lot of rabble-rousing on my campus, particularly, but people were very aware.
What did people think about President Lyndon Johnson?
I have no recollection about that at all.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I don't remember talking about it. I don't remember. Although I have a lot of books, and I've kept many books that I had from college, and I don't remember if you know the book McBird. Mm. It was a skinny little book, and I saw it on my shelf the other day, and if I'm remembering correctly, and I may be wrong, I should really read it. Mm-hmm. I think it was a satire on Lyndon Johnson and the war.
So you went to Yale for graduate school in
graduate
architecture,
school, yes.
and how did that go?
Well, I had met my husband, or my future husband, my very last semester of college, and he was at Yale Medical School. So I wanted very much to be at Yale.
How did you meet?
We met on a blind date. He was not my date. Somebody else was my date, but he had come along for the ride, and that's how we had met. And so I wanted to be in New Haven, and Yale is just a phenomenal school, and the education is phenomenal, and the people who you are exposed to on your juries and as teachers are just incredible. So it is really an experience of a lifetime to go to architecture school there.
Are you involved in alumni activities for Yale?
You write a check every year. But we just had a 40th reunion. We had never had a reunion, and some of my classmates decided that we should have a reunion. And so I went with my husband in October, and it was just a blast. It was great. It was so nice to see everyone. People presented what they had been doing if they wanted to. We all shared stories. We all sort of exposed our weaknesses that no one would expose at the time that they were in school, because there was a certain level of, I guess, competition and not wanting to make a fool of yourself. But as we all went around the room and told little stories, it turned out that everyone had funny stories to tell about embarrassing things that happened, not when they weren't so perfect. And it was really a wonderful, wonderful thing to be part of that. Yeah.
And tell us your husband's name.
My husband's name is Earl. He grew up in St. Louis.
Earl Extein, and what was he studying at Yale Medical School?
Excuse me. So my husband grew up in St. Louis, and he went to the University of Chicago as an undergrad. He was a psychology major. He went to Yale Medical School, straight from college, and we met when he was, I guess, finishing his second year. And I got married. We got married after my first year of architecture school. So he had just started his internship, which he did in New Haven, at a hospital called St. Raphael's, a community hospital. And then he did his residency in psychiatry at Yale.
So in the early years of your marriage, you were living at Yale, living in New Haven.
Yes.
And tell me about the years after that and how you gradually came to Boca Raton.
Well, we meandered our way down the East Coast, basically. We moved from New Haven to, well, I worked for a year in Bridgeport, Connecticut, commuting back and forth from New Haven while he finished up another year of his residency. And then he decided he wanted, instead of his third year residency, he wanted to do a fellowship at the National Institutes of Mental Health. So we moved to Bethesda, Maryland, where I got a job downtown working for an architectural firm. And then we had our first child, Melissa. So we lived in Bethesda for 2 years, I guess it was. And then we moved to Summit, New Jersey, where my husband was affiliated at a psychiatric hospital with some colleagues that he had known from Yale. And then we moved to Ridgewood, New Jersey after 2 years, where he became a medical director of a hospital up in lower New York State. And then we moved to Boca Raton, where we came down here because he was asked to be the medical director of Fair Oaks Hospital, which was a freestanding psychiatric hospital affiliated with Delray Medical Center.
So that was a big opportunity.
Right. So I had 2 little children at the time, 4 and 2.
And Melissa, and the other one was?
Yeah. Jason, and I was 7 months pregnant.
Oh.
So I was not thrilled about moving when I was 7 months pregnant to Florida, but we moved to Florida.
So how did he get the offer? You were living in New Jersey, and this offer to become the head of this hospital came to you, and you knew it was at Boca Raton. What did you know about Boca Raton at the time?
I knew nothing about Boca Raton. He was still associated with the same group. It was two people who were in the faculty at Yale Medical School and two people who were classmates of his at the medical school who were starting this hospital. And that's how he came to come, to have the job. I knew nothing about Florida. The only thing that I knew was I need to find a really good school for my kids or I'm not going. So that was the criteria for me. So we came down, we looked around, and I didn't see any good schools, and I was really upset because the public schools were terrible at the time. They had corporal punishment. I was really terrified. So,
wow.
Yeah. I don't know if they actually did it, but it was on the books that they could if they wanted to. So as we were, looking around, we stopped at Bethel to look at nursery schools for Jason. And we had a conversation with the director of the nursery school, and she said to us, well, have you heard of Pinecrest? They said, no, what's Pinecrest? And they said, well, Pinecrest is a very fine private school in Fort Lauderdale. So literally on the way to the airport to leave, we stopped at Pinecrest, and I thought, well, this is definitely a possibility. So after we got home, I did a little more research, and Pinecrest seemed to have a wonderful reputation. So I flew back with Melissa to have an interview. And she got accepted, and that was the beginning of my 4 kids going to Pinecrest in Fort Lauderdale, always in Fort Lauderdale.
When did Pinecrest establish its campus in Boca Raton itself?
I don't know the exact year. The campus existed, not the way it looks now by any stretch of the imagination, but it was called Boca Academy, and it was not the same caliber academically as Pinecrest at the time, but later someone bought the school and then sold it to Pinecrest, and I don't remember the exact story, but they sold it to Pinecrest, and then Pinecrest established their Boca campus. And after a number of years, they kept on ratcheting up their academic standards to the point where, it was obvious, it was equal. But Pinecrest in Fort Lauderdale has an upper school, and the Boca campus has never had an upper school.
Oh, I see. So it was in Fort Lauderdale, and you were living in Boca Raton.
Right.
How did they get to school every morning?
I drove.
How long a drive was
2
it?
round trips every day for a while.
How long
It's
a drive
about, I don't know, maybe it's about 30 miles. It's probably not even that long. Depending on the traffic, it was like about a 45-minute drive. And, I was juggling I had two smaller children who were born once we moved here. So I was juggling between nursery school and babies at home and driving to Pinecrest, and some years they would take the bus, and some years they would take the bus one way, and I would pick them up the other way. And some years, when they finally got their driver's licenses, they drove themselves. But
So how many children did you have altogether?
4.
And did you, you're talking about private schools in Boca Raton. Tell me a little bit about St. Andrews. Was that ever a consideration, or was it even there?
St. Andrews, if I'm remembering correctly, was only an upper school at the time, and we didn't really consider it.
Okay. No, I think Pinecrest, I've heard, had a large Jewish population among the student body. Do you recall it
Not
that way?
so large. Not when we started. As time went on, more so, but not so much in the beginning.
Okay. So, where did you live when you first came to Boca Raton? What house did you live in?
We rented a house in Mill Pond, and as we were renting this house, we built a house in Boca West, where we've lived ever since.
So, when you were here, you started getting involved in, I think, various activities in the Jewish community. Tell us about some of those. What are some
Well,
of the
I got involved actually in both Jewish and non-Jewish organizations because I really felt like I wanted to be part of the community. And I guess, being home with children, I had a little pent-up energy that I wanted to, be able to have something for myself. So I joined the National Council of Jewish Women. I joined Hadassah. I had belonged to Hadassah in New Jersey very briefly before we moved. So I joined Hadassah. The chapter that I joined was Sabra, and it was actually sort of split between Lighthouse Point at the time and Boca. And I sat on the board of the Boca Children's Museum, Singing Pines. And there were some years when I sat on the board of the Children's Science Explorium. So I got to meet, other women in the community, not Jewish women, and got to know them. A lot of the things I did had to do with my children's activities. We joined B'nai Torah. I did some, I sat on the education committee, and, wherever I am, I seem to sort of try and get involved more than just being a member. And I guess, I was part of a group that took a very interesting and wonderful leadership course from the Jewish Federation when I was much younger, which I really enjoyed. And, I did some things for Israel Bonds. I chaired a women's division lunch. I was on the board of American Jewish Committee for a few years. So I was, always had my fingers in a lot of things, but Hadassah was my main thing.
So let's talk a little bit about that, and if you can, give me some details about what life was like in Boca at that time. But what was B'nai Torah like when you joined? How many people were in it?
Well, I don't know how many people were there, but it was a very small congregation on the east side of Boca. I guess it's on 4th and Glades. That building is still, I believe, a synagogue. It was a very nice Hamish group of people that I met. They were very welcoming and very sweet, and I had small children. So that was nice. And, it has since obviously become a humongous synagogue, but it wasn't at the time. We joined the JCC. My husband played basketball there. We weren't, super religious, but we would show up on the major holidays, and the kids all went to Hebrew school. We're all bar and bat mitzvahed. As a matter of fact, Jason, this was when B'nai Torah had already moved to their present synagogue. Excuse me. Jason's bar mitzvah turned out to be Rabbi Steinhardt's tryout weekend.
Oh,
so that was kind of interesting. Yes.
Tell us a little about that.
Exactly expecting that, but that's the way it turned out. Yes.
He just you were looking for a new rabbi, and that just happened to be the week he was coming. How did he do? He
did fine. But that was like, what do you mean the rabbi's not going to be here?
Yes.
And Rabbi Steinhardt is still here, so.
What about the rabbi that Jason had been working with?
That was Steinhardt's audition, can I tell you?
Okay. And tell me about the Federation training program that you did.
Oh, it was phenomenal. I don't know if they still do things like this anymore, and I don't know whose idea it was, but it was a group of us. They wanted to build some leadership in the community among the younger people, and they brought in wonderful, wonderful speakers. Yitz Greenberg presented to us, and
Was this for everybody or just the women?
no, it was men and women. Rob Wexler was part of the group. Ron Klein was part of the group. Phil Habers were part of the group. People who went on to take positions at the Jewish Federation and in other organizations. There was no expectation that you had to rise in the Federation leadership, which is why I really appreciated it. They just wanted to build leaders for the community. So Wolf Blitzer came. This was right before he got his job at CNN. He was still, I guess, a Jerusalem Post reporter at the time. It was wonderful. It was just wonderful. I don't remember how many of us there were. I would say less than 20, but I don't remember the exact number. We had a retreat, I remember. It was just, I gravitate toward anything that has to do with education, so I really, really appreciated it.
Mm-hmm. And how old were you roughly when you did this workshop?
Well, we moved here in 1984.
In decades.
So that would make me, what would that make me? 34 when we moved here.
Mm-hmm.
So in that, between my 30s to 40-ish.
So
I
would
don't
you
remember
say
exactly when.
Would you say you benefited a lot from that and used what you learned there?
Absolutely.
So you were involved in both Hadassah and National Council of Jewish Women?
I was not that involved with council. I joined because it was a women's Jewish organization and I wanted to meet people. That's when I first met Susie Tabor, years and years ago. And I just wanted to, see where I felt comfortable, and I always felt like it was important to give back. So, so I felt more comfortable in Hadassah, but I would go to National Council, luncheons and whatever was going on. Same with Jewish Federation. I would go to the Women's Division lunch, but I was never really like an officer in the Federation or anything like that.
Mm-hmm. You had we had a discussion actually before this interview comparing, what kind of Jewish organization do I want to get involved in? Comparing Federation versus Hadassah versus, what are the advantages and pluses and strengths of each?
That's a good question. The thing I liked about Hadassah was you were not judged on how much you gave, and there was no preference given to people who were big givers versus just people who could give of their time. So I liked that sort of equal playing field, that everyone was welcome and everyone was equal. And there also was a lot of emphasis on education in Hadassah. There were a lot of study groups and educational modules that Hadassah would produce. I was part of, from really the first year that I moved to Boca, in Florida, there was a Young Leaders Institute where I would get together with other women all across Florida. A young leader was defined as anyone under the age of 45. So I would get together with women in Hadassah all across Florida, and we would get together. First, we would plan the event, which was a weekend retreat. So we would learn a lot of skills just planning the event. And it always had a theme, and we would, get outside speakers, and, sort of had a formula as to how to put it together. And I formed, and we did that for years. 10, 15, a long time, every year. And I made wonderful friendships. And all of those women, I would say almost all of those women, went on to take leadership positions in Hadassah and ended up on the Hadassah National Board. But the real treat of those institutes was they always had what they called a Hadassah Star, which was an older, experienced leader in Hadassah, someone on the national board, a Hadassah national president, and they would be our guest for the weekend. And they would, speak with us and interact with us and answer questions and, act as a mentor and hang out in their pajamas with us. And it was really something. There's something about Hadassah that it crosses generations, and you learn from the most interesting women who've had very interesting life experiences, and they're so happy to share, with younger women. It's really quite wonderful. I was going through a lot of papers this weekend, and I came across a lot of Hadassah things, and I didn't remember how much, it offered to me. So many opportunities. We did so many exciting things. It really, that creative energy that I was not getting to release with 4 little children at home, it really gave me an outlet for being able to use my brain a little bit, be organized and get women together and talk about exciting issues, and it was special.
What were some of the causes you worked on, or some of the issues you worked on?
There was a woman, Carol Diamond, who wrote a number of books for Hadassah. One was called Jewish Marital Status, which, was about, women who are single, women who are divorced, women who have AIDS, women, there was just a whole combination of things, and that was a particular seminar. They wrote whole books about Zionism, present-day Zionism, which, but they would, everything would be in depth, There were just a lot of really interesting. There was one on ecology, and this was a long time ago. I don't know. I guess I forget that those things were really more prominently in the news, and then I guess the way our country has gone, they've sort of taken it back. You would think it would be more prominent. Instead, it's sort of not so prominent anymore. But at the time, that was a big topic, and it was sort of a Jewish perspective on ecology, and there was just a wide range, women's health issues, all kinds of things about women's health issues.
What controversies, if any, do you remember about Israel in particular, if any?
In what way do you mean?
About were there anything? Was Israel something that united people? I mean, Hadassah was supposed to work to help Israeli institutions. Was there ever a time when there was a question about anything Israel was doing?
Well, Hadassah's philosophy was always, we were Zionists. It's a Women's Zionist Organization of America. We supported Israel in, whatever government. We weren't political, but we supported the state of Israel. And, we built these incredible institutions of medicine there. I think, excuse me. During the women, Hadassah women were very, moved when there were wars. I mean, they would be like on a plane, send me to the middle of whatever's going on. I did not do that, but there were women when the Scuds were flying in. I don't even remember when that was.
1991.
Yeah. There were Hadassah women, running to Israel. And so I don't remember any real controversy. I think the controversy about Israel is more present right now. The issues of plurality. Hadassah is prides itself on being all streams and no streams of Judaism. And Israel, right now is having a problem with that.
No, it is an issue now.
So, I don't, so those kinds of political things I think are more current than they were a while ago.
Let me ask you from a bird's eye perspective about the Boca Raton Jewish community in general and Boca Raton in general. First, let me ask you, what do you remember physically about the town and how it grew?
Well, when we first moved here, we were living in Boca West, and I remember...
Was that part of the city or the township?
It's never been part of the city. It's still not part of the city. But you could not go up Jog Road the way you can now. You had to sort of zigzag around because it didn't go all the way. I remember Yamato Road had a farm where Broken Sound is and a farm stand. I remember the boys used to have a little farm stand on Linton Boulevard before it became what it is now. I think there was a few iterations in between, if I'm remembering correctly.
Was Delray Hospital even there on Linton Boulevard?
No.
Where was
well,
it?
Fair Oaks wasn't built, so that was being built. I guess Delray Hospital must have been there. Must have been built a little before that. It was just, the east side of Boca was, there wasn't that much west at all, and it was just a much smaller community. I sort of felt like, maybe because I did make an effort to, as I said, I joined the Children's Science Explorium and the Children's Museum, but I felt that the Jewish community didn't particularly mix with the non-Jewish community. There was the Junior League, and I didn't know any Jewish women who belonged to the Junior League, and then there was, the synagogues and Hadassah and whatever. But, I went to college, and I, grew up and lived in Summit and Ridgewood, which were not predominantly Jewish places, and I always felt like I wanted to be part of the whole community and not just the Jewish community.
But would you say that it would be fair to say that Jewish people and non-Jewish people moved in more or less separate social circles at the time?
I think they did. At least that was my perception.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, what were some of the differences between the city? How did they demarcate the city versus the West Boca at the time that you remember? How did that change over time?
I don't think there was really any great demarcation. It's just, just things got built. I mean, Woodfield was just Woodfield 1. There was no Woodfield 2. There was no Woodfield Country Club. All the stuff going up Jog Road didn't exist. Royal Palm was a big polo field and had, for years and years and years. As a matter of fact, I used to take, I don't remember which child it was, we used to drive over there and go look at the horses in the stalls, which was literally 2 blocks from my house. And West Boca just kept on, developing. There was just more and more stuff. So I don't really ever think about that there's the city of Boca and then, the rest of it. I sort of think of it as a whole, but I guess it wasn't a whole. I mean, Meisner wasn't built. That was like an old crummy shopping center. And, Town Center was barely there. I guess what they now call Boca Center, and I still call Crocker Center, wasn't there. There's a tremendous amount of things that have changed.
When was Kravis Center for the Performing Arts? When did that become a place to go?
I don't know. I never go there. I have a husband who works 100 hours a week. We're not running to concerts and theater. Where we go in New York.
Fair enough. What about the different denominations, the different streams of Judaism? Your synagogue was a conservative a synagogue that you belonged to for most of the time. What were the relations between the conservatives, the Reform, the non-affiliated? What about Chabad and the Orthodox? What do you remember about?
I wasn't aware of the Orthodox community particularly until at one point my husband has religious cousins, and they were here in Boca for a little while, and they joined the Boca Raton synagogue. So I became a little more aware of that community, but not so much. You know, my kids went, the little ones, not Melissa, because Melissa started at Pinecrest in kindergarten when we first moved down, but before, they all went to preschool there, but there was preschool, before Pinecrest preschool. So my kids made the rounds of every one. So one went to the JCC when it was a tiny little JCC in East Boca. One went to Bethel, and one went to B'nai Israel for preschool. So you know there was a mixing. I don't think people were so like I don't belong to this one and you belong to that one kind of thing.
So were you aware of the influx around the Montoya Circle or anything that was going on there?
No, I mean, I was aware of it, but it wasn't, Orthodox women don't usually join Hadassah, so there weren't very many Orthodox women in Hadassah. There were a handful, but that wasn't really their thing. And so, no, I sort of knew it was there, but it wasn't part of, what I did.
Do you remember from the time you came in 1984, any serious or even not so serious anti-Semitism or things people said or things you heard about from other people that?
I never felt any anti-Semitism personally. The only thing that was slightly, I guess you could say, somewhat anti-Semitic is when we first came here and were looking for houses. We didn't know the neighborhoods or anything about them. So we were looking in Royal Palm, and our real estate agent sort of steered us away from Royal Palm, with the implication that this isn't the neighborhood for you. But that was the only, thing that I recall.
Trying to think, is there anything else that you'd like to tell me about any of your activities that you think are important?
Actually there is. I realized that I didn't mention it. This is in the last 5 years, I guess, or a little less than that. I've become involved in the PJ Library.
Oh, yes.
Which I knew about. Well, through Hadassah, I sat on the board of a summer camp that was sponsored by Hadassah in Hendersonville, North Carolina, called Camp Judea. And through Camp Judea, I met Harold Grinspoon, who funded a lot of the things at Camp Judea with matching grants, and I went to a number of institutes that Harold had sponsored in Springfield, Massachusetts. And then he started PJ Library, which is a wonderful program of free books to young children from 6 months to now. It goes, I don't know where it stops. It was, I think, through the 3rd grade, and now it's PJ My Way, and it goes even farther up. But he sent, they send free books to Jewish-themed books, not religious books, but Jewish-themed books to children. And I thought that was phenomenal. And I was so grateful to Harold for what he had done for Camp Judea that I really was important to me to give back. So when they started PJ Library in Boca, after many years of trying to get it off the ground, I said, I'm in. And so I became a supporter of PJ Library, which, as I said, I always gravitate to what's for kids and what's for education. That's my two important things.
And tell us quickly what PJ Library does.
Well, as I said, you sign your child up at birth or whatever When they are 6 months old, every month in the mail, they get a book, an age-appropriate book. And it comes with a little explanation so that the parent, who is often not necessarily a Jewish parent because it could be an intermarried family, it gives them a little background of the theme, whatever the book is about. Sometimes it's a thing of music. Sometimes I once got a tzedakah box that you put together. There's a variety of things, and they do it, as I said, age appropriate. And then when it's in your community, they try and organize activities around it because they want young families to eventually affiliate in the Jewish community. So they sponsor story hours, and they sponsor concerts, and they sponsor ice cream socials, and it's an opportunity for young moms, which I am no longer a young mom, but I know what that was like, to meet other young parents, not so much moms, I'm being very sexist, young parents, to meet other young parents in a Jewish setting, and hopefully, affiliate with the synagogue when the time comes. And it's a way to continue, the Jewish community, which for Harold, it's what he's all about. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's why he sponsors, why he's so involved in Jewish camps, and he's expanded the PJ Library to Israel, to other countries. It's wonderful. Yesterday, I had a package at my doorstep, and it was pretty large, and it was because I'm a supporter, a financial supporter. Harold sends me books every month. So I had a fairly large box on my doorstep, and I opened it up, and it was the most beautiful book I have ever seen. I don't know who had this idea. It was an art book, basically. It was in a slipcase. It was about this big, and it was a series of posters which illustrated quotations from famous people, some from the Bible, all done by very well-known artists, and it is magnificent. It is just beautiful. He is a visionary. Mm-hmm. He really is.
He's a very great philanthropist.
Yes, yes.
Well, Ms. Extein, thank you so much for speaking with us today. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it, Miriam. You're a great interviewer.
Thank you.